Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's a wonderful opportunity to get to learn about some really incredible and important local history. So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker. My name is Lee Kolb. I teach English and journalism at East Central College, and I also organize our film and lecture series. And it is my honor to introduce David Menke. He's a retired teacher and school administrator who spent 31 years in the field of education. He graduated from New Haven High School and holds degrees from Southeast Missouri State University and the University of Missouri. With a special interest in history, he has written numerous articles and books on local history. Currently, David is president of the New Haven Preservation Society and the New Haven German American Club, and is on the board of directors of the New Haven Chamber of Commerce. David says his greatest accomplishment was marrying his high school sweetheart, Joan. Married for 57 years, they now try to keep up with their 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. They live on a farm west of New Haven near the small community of Etla. Welcome, David, and thank you so much.
Oh, okay.
Well, good evening. Thank you for that introduction, Lee. And I apologize for my short-sightedness as far as being able to begin a Zoom presentation. So hopefully we're off and running here now. Again, appreciate your interest in this subject, and I'll try to share with you some of the more important and key issues relating to the Annabelle Chapel. Now, I'd like to start out with somewhat of a disclaimer, and that is, you get labels sometimes, and in my case, sometimes people say historian. Well, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm certainly not an expert on anything. I often say that I know a lot about many things and not much about anything, but I know a little bit about Annabelle Chapel, and I'm going to share some of that with you. The thing that I think is important to understand at the outset is that this is a subject that is historically, there are some missing links. In other words, we don't claim to know everything that we should about the background and history of Annabelle Chapel. When you study history and study a specific subject, you like to have what we call primary sources. And primary sources can be a number of things. Generally, primary sources represent an item that there is a written historical record that we can assume is accurate. There are some things, for instance, that are recorded legal documents, census data, marriage licenses. Those kinds of things are primary sources, and we can assume that they are accurate. However, there's various shades of gray, I think, in history, and sometimes the source information is questionable, especially if it's a verbal history or oral history. And in this case, we're going to be talking about some things that are actually oral history. And if it's something that's been passed down from generation to generation, you have to be very cautious in interpreting it. I think about, a situation in my own family where my great-grandpa, he lived up near Berger, and one day he was walking up the railroad track to Berger. They lived close to the railroad, and lo and behold, along came a steam train and hit him, and unfortunately, great-grandpa was killed. Well, the story was that why did this happen? And part of the story was that, well, Grandpa couldn't hear very well, and undoubtedly he didn't hear this train coming. But there's another story that's been passed down through the family, and that is that Grandpa liked to partake of beverage, and that it may have been that that he had imbibed a little bit too much, and for that reason he didn't hear the train. So who knows? I'd like to think that his hearing was bad, but so we deal with those kinds of issues. We're certainly not always able to say definitively what happened at a certain time, or what who was involved in all of those various issues. So we're going to talk about Annabelle Chapel, but before we can deal with Annabelle Chapel, we've got to talk about an African-American former slave by the name of Annabelle. Now, she's really the main character in this story. And she, of course, is going to be closely tied to the history of the chapel itself. We know a little bit about Annabelle. Annabelle was born actually in Montgomery County across the river, and somehow her family moved into the Etla Bottoms prior to the Civil War. We're pretty certain of that. And there she married. She was probably married twice, according to the information that we have. One, her first marriage was to a prior. Undoubtedly, he passed away, and then she married a Bell. And she had a long-standing marriage with this Mr. Bell. Her maiden name was Carrie. But anyhow, you can see here on the screen, and this is a representation. We don't have an accurate photo, or we have no photo of Annabelle. So we certainly do not know what Annabelle looked like. She lived from 1828 to 1905. To the Etla Bottom. Well, this is a map that illustrates the Etla area. This goes from New Haven up to Berger. This is a floodplain of the Missouri River. And that area, beginning in the mid-1800s, was settled by a variety of groups. A lot of German immigrants came here. In fact, my own family, my own Menke family immigrated to this area in the 1870s. There were also some English settlers, and there were some Southerners that had land here. And for that reason, we suspect that there were slaves here in this bottom. Now, the Etla Bottom, historically, very good soil, but occasional flooding. And that's going to create an important part of this story as we go along here. So here we are at Etla. Here's New Haven. A good portion of this area probably at that time was still forested, but these settlers were clearing that land, a very fertile alluvial material, and I'm sure that it was a very productive farming situation. So here we have an illustration. This is an actual photograph, and I don't know where this was taken. It's certainly not in the Etla Bottom, but it's representative of what the slaves were confronted with, working in the fields, long hours, hard labor, and the servitude that they were subjected to is very despicable, but we know that that's part of our history. Now, one thing that the slaves initiated when they were working in the fields like this, often they were not encouraged to do a lot of conversation, because the keeper of the group, he would of course insist that they work and not be talking all the time. But one thing they did develop were chants, and so they would chant and sing as a group. Some of those chants were called field hollers, and it was a way to, I guess, get your mind off of what you were doing, and in some ways, I'm sure it was a means of passing the time. And so these field chants oftentimes had a religious connotation to them, and they became the basis then of the Negro spiritual, which we're familiar with. And I thought this particular picture lends itself to a particular field chant or song, and I'd like to play it for you. I've got it here on on our slides, so let's see if we can listen to it.
Oh, Emma, oh, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma, oh, oh, Emma, oh, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma, oh, say, Emma, you run the country. Oh, Emma, oh, well, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma, oh, Emma, help me to pull these weeds. Oh, Emma, oh, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma, oh, Emma works harder than two grown men. Oh, Emma, oh, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma, oh, oh, Emma, oh, you turn around, dig a hole in the ground. Oh, Emma, oh.
One thing I would call to your attention to is the type of hoe that they were using here. You notice it's a very wide framed hoe. And there's a little background, a little story that some of you may have heard about regarding hoe cakes. I don't know if you've ever had hoe cakes, but my wife occasionally, we actually have hoe cakes. Of course, we don't make them the way I'm going to describe the way they made it, but often in the fields, maybe they were some distance away from the living quarters. And so they would take a little cornmeal with them and probably an egg or whatever else they needed. They'd build a little fire and they'd get some coals, get some hot coals there. And then they'd take the blade of this hoe and they'd put it on that fire until the hoe would get hot enough. And then they would put the cornmeal batter on the hoe and make hoe cakes. Now, there were some historians that questioned this, but there's quite a bit of information that suggests that this actually did happen. I think they'd have to be careful of not get their handle on fire, but I guess they could position the hoe there on the coals in such a way that it became kind of a skillet for making these hoe cakes. So if you want to try to do that sometime, get your garden hoe and see if you make some hoe cakes. Conditions down in the upper bottom, we don't have any photographs or anything, but this was a typical cabin that the African Americans would have lived in. You can see here the family and a large number of kids. Annabelle had 7 children during her lifetime. Obviously, probably from 2 different husbands. The thing about life on the plantation, or even life here in Missouri, there was a sizable infant mortality. A lot of children never made it to adulthood. In the case of Annabelle, we believe that 3 of her children survived to adulthood. Again, some of that's a little bit uncertain, but that's what some of the literature suggests. Here was another example of a little shack. This one had a tin roof and some wood siding, maybe a little bit better housing. At the end of the Civil War, I guess I ought to back up and just mention, as far as slavery was concerned, in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves. Now, that didn't really free all of the slaves. It only freed the slaves that were in the succession states. In other words, just in the southern states. So, for instance, here in Missouri, Missouri had not seceded from the Union. Missouri was considered a border state, Annabelle at that time, if she had not been freed by her master, she would have still been enslaved. Now, the next big thing that happens, that we're getting close to the end of the war now, in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. And of course, that actually provided for freedom for all of the slaves. And so we can be reasonably sure then that by that point, that Annabelle and her family would have been freed. Now, that doesn't mean that they left their master. In many cases, even these freed slaves, they had no place to go. And usually with the master, they would work out an arrangement where they could rent part of the ground and maybe get a portion of the income from the ground, although that was always something that was negotiated in the favor of the landowner and not the slave, or the free slave now. And this particular picture is meaningful in that at the end of the war, General Sherman initiated I guess you would call it a declaration. It wasn't actually a law as such, but that would provide for the now freed slaves to have 40 acres and a mule. And it was an attempt at what today we call reparations, to give them something for the fact that they had to have some kind of livelihood. So it was an interesting concept. Unfortunately, it really wasn't put into effect in very many places. There were a few places in the South where they were able to do that, but that met with resistance from a lot of the farmer plantation owners. And so most of the slaves did not get that mule and that 40 acres. Another interesting aspect of the slave life was the importance of religion. When the first slaves came to America, they were not Christians. Now, there might have been a few rare cases where they had been introduced to Christianity in Africa, but generally not. And so they practiced their own spirit worship and religion, which they had from their place of origin. Now, when they came to America, there was the attempt by sometimes by the plantation owner to bring Christianity to these people. But it was kind of a devious thing that they were doing. They were bringing it forth because there were some admonitions in the Bible that talk about obeying your master. And so they felt that here, we're gonna bring Christianity here, but we're gonna use it as a wedge so as to ensure that you're going to obey and follow our rules here on the plantation. And so that did happen. And so some of the plantation owners actually promoted Christianity for that reason. There were other situations, though, where as some Africans learned to read, where they could read the Bible or had been taught the Bible, you had these itinerant pastors, in this case, maybe this one right here, a black pastor, that would come to the plantation and would present the word, the Christian message. Now, I mentioned the fact that they had to be able to read the Bible. If you were going to be a pastor, of course, you had to be able to preach and you had to know some Bible. The unfortunate thing is that very few of the slaves, farmer slaves, eventually, could read. Only about 10% of the slave population were literate. So that was an issue. And then we get in from that, we get into the issue of education. In many of the states in the South, it was against the law for a slave to go to school or to be educated. They did not, the slave owners did not want slaves to be able to read and write for the fear that they would then use that possibly as a means of disrupting the normal life there on the plantation. If they could read the Bible, that was significant. And getting back to what I was just telling you about, the slave, the master, and his preacher, his white preacher, would often refer to verses like, here's Paul's letter to the Corinthians, or the Colossians rather, and they'd pick verses like this: slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters. Okay, you get the message. You see what they're trying to do here. Now, if they would have been theologically honest and would have gone a few verses further, they would have encountered this: masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. Well, okay, you can imagine they wouldn't have focused on that, because that would have sent the wrong message to these enslaved Africans. So let's get to Annabelle for a minute now. Annabelle, we know, based upon the rest of the story, which we're going to get into here, that she was a very devout Christian. And we can assume that she led a prayerful life. And so this just as well could have been Annabelle praying down along the river, along the creek. And we anticipate that her solid faith is going to be instrumental in everything that we're going to be talking about as we continue in this discussion. Now, we do know that, and this was probably largely because of Annabelle, they did build a little log church in the Etla Bottoms. Now, we don't know the exact date of that, but it was probably sometime around the end of the Civil War. And this is just a representation of an old log building. I'm sure it wouldn't have been very big. It would have been probably rather crude. But yes, here was a little church where these families, and there weren't many of them. There wouldn't have been very many families living down there in the Upper Bottom. But there were some, and maybe some from even in the hills would come down to this little log church and worship. Well, the problem there with that that church, and also if they were living in the river bottom, is that the river bottoms are prone to flooding. And this was almost a seasonal thing. Of course, there were no levees, there was no flood control mechanisms. So you could anticipate from time to time, not maybe every year, but every few years, you'd be faced with a flood. And so you'd have to vacate the river bottom and go in the hills until the flood waters would recede. Well, that got to be a real problem for these families. And so eventually, this is a map again that shows, this is the Etla Bottoms here. Eventually, they left that bottomland, and many of them moved into the hills, found land that they could rent, or in the case of Annabelle, now this is 1898 here, we find that Annabelle actually had title to 42 acres. Where this is located, Cedar Creek would be over in here somewhere. This is Cedar Creek. And these are the Etla, what we call the Etla Knobs. Those are the real high hills between Etla and New Haven. And so just below that Etla Knob area, Annabelle, the records show that she had property. And if you go back further in the deeds, we find that Anna Terry owned this property back in the 1870s already. Now, that's kind of strange, and I can't fully explain this, but Terry was her maiden name, but she would have been married by the 1870s. Most certainly she'd have been married by that time. And so whether this might have been a case of her specific ownership and not her husband's, or maybe it was a relative, but the fact remains that they had, by this time, or at least by probably in the 1870s, somewhere in that neighborhood, they had left the floodplain, they'd left the bottoms, and they had gone into the hills. Okay, so the question is, what about the church? What happened to the church? Well, here we get into some oral history. And I told you before that, you know, you got to be suspect sometimes of oral history. But one of the interesting stories of Annabelle is that there was a point at which they needed to build a new church. And so they had to raise some money. And so the story is that Annabelle got on her horse. I don't know whether she rode side saddle like this, but maybe she did. And she went through the streets of New Haven, soliciting donations from the residents of the town. Now, the record is, or the story is, that they were pretty benevolent, and so the nickels and the dimes, I don't know, maybe a quarter now and then, but you can imagine we're talking about sometime in the 1870s probably, or early 1880s. They wouldn't have been giving out dollar bills probably, but they would have probably been giving out coins. And so she was able to collect a sufficient sum of money that eventually they were going to be able to build a new church. Now, part of that story that I was relating to you, the verbal history suggests that they actually moved the church from in the bottom to New Haven. But we're going to find, and I'll show that to you in a second here, that doesn't quite stand the test of history. And we'll see that in a second. But anyhow, here we're talking about building a new church. So when did this happen? So we go back to some of the city maps. And this is New Haven, 1878. And this arrow shows where the current Annabelle Chapel is located. Now, there's no chapel there. So there was no chapel there in 1878. And if indeed they had moved this church out of the bottom, it wouldn't necessarily have gone there. It could have been anywhere here. But again, there's no record suggesting where that church would have been moved to. Now, while I've got this map up, I wanted to just share with you, by the post-Civil War, there were a fair number of African-American families living in and around New Haven, the New Haven area. This particular location was not one of the locations where they lived. In fact, even though the church eventually would be located here, there were no African Americans living in close proximity. Most of them lived down in this area here off of North Street. We call that Baptist Hill. And here we've got McNair. Can't see the names on here. And there's Kemp Street, and over here is Catalba Street, and there's Morgan here and Olive. This is the area right here where most of the African American families tended to cluster. Now, we're dealing with segregation. These families were being segregated from the rest of the New Haven community. Now, there's nothing particular unusual about that. I mean, it wasn't unique to New Haven. This was happening in every small town across America, where the black folk lived in one area and the white folk lived in a different area. So this is where most of them lived. In addition to Annabelle Chapel, which we're going to eventually get up here in this location, in the 1890s, early 1890s, another church was established, and it's just off the end of my cursor down here on Catawba Street. And that was the Second Christian Church. The second Christian, it had to be the Second Christian Church because the First Christian Church was a white church up here on Wall Street, about where my cursor is there. Today, there's a little park there commemorating that location. That was the First Christian Church. So the Second Christian Church was over here. So by the 1890s, mid 1890s, we're going to have the Annabelle Chapel up here, and we're going to have the Second Christian Church down here. Now, an interesting facet, even though some blacks went here and some blacks went down here, in 1904, the two churches got together, shared some resources, and went out and bought an acre of ground west of town on Olive Road and established the Baltimore Cemetery. Now, if you've driven Olive Road, you passed by the Nortman Cemetery, which is a big cemetery, but right adjacent to it is the Black Cemetery, or I should say African American Cemetery. And that was established in 1904 by a joint effort of the Annabelle and the Second Christian Church. So now we move on. Now this is a map of New Haven. This is early 1900s. I'm not positive about the exact date, but early 1900s. And now that street that I was pointing to, that's Selma Street up here, here it is. And there's the label, Colored Church. That's the Annabelle Chapel. And I mentioned the Christian church before, and I think it shows up, yeah, right here. It says church on Wall Street. That's the First Christian Church. And that First Christian Church was where a lot of the early settlers, early founders of New Haven went to church there. So now we know, here we have that church. Okay, and this is out of place, I'm sorry, I should have had that previously, but here's the Baltimore Cemetery that I told you was a joint effort of Annabelle and the Second Christian Church. When I first introduced our discussion, I mentioned primary sources as being the most reliable sources and the most important. Well, here is a primary source, which is very important to the history of Annabelle Chapel. And I'm going to just kind of buzz through it a little bit here. This was an article of agreement. This was a contract of sorts. 19th of October of 1891. 1891. Now, we've got to keep that date in mind. Between the owner, he would have been the first party, J.G. Warnkin, and two gentlemen, Joseph Hughes and William Lucky, trustees of the A.M.E. Church. Okay, now, what are we doing? Well, we're acquiring 1/4 of an acre of ground from Warnkin. And this is a legal description of that ground. And what money's exchanging hands? Well, the second party, which is the A.M.E. people, are going to purchase for the sum of $100 this property right here. And they're going to pay for it in this manner. They're going to pay $25 cash in hand. And then 2 years from this 19th day of October, the sum of $75. So they're going to pay $100 for this lot here. Now, the other thing we have to look at is this is part of the same contract, but we couldn't get it all on one page. This is the signature part of the contract. And so here's J.J. Warnken, the owner of the land. And here's the two buyers. It's Joseph Hughes and William Lucky. Now notice they put their mark, and that tells us that they could not sign their name. So they were not literate. But here's the interesting thing. Notice who the witness was. The witness was Anne Berry. You know, they were talking about Anna Berry. So she was very much involved in this thing. We can be sure of that. So the next thing, okay, we bought this land now. We're going to have this land bought. And so they're going to build a church. And within a year, 1893, the congregation had entered into a contract with two builders from Jefferson City to erect a 30 by 24 foot wide frame church. And this says, you can't see it there, at least I can, in first class style. Now that's interesting. In first class style. In other words, this wasn't going to be just any church. This was going to be a first class church. And we're going to build it for $110. How about that, folks? $110. And the building was to be fitted with one flue, one door, 8 windows, and construction to be completed within 60 days, if the weather permits. Now, can you get anything built in 60 days today? I don't think so. Not post-COVID anyhow. But it was going to be a first-class style church. Among the church trustees who signed the building contract dated July 6, 1893 was Anna Bell, a 64-year-old literate Black woman who was born in Missouri in 1826 to an African-American mother and a Tennessee-born father. So now we're kind of, now that whole story about moving a church to New Haven, that doesn't hold water, does it? Maybe they did move it out of the bottom, and maybe they moved it up on her farm or someplace. Again, we don't know that. But certainly they didn't move it to this site here because this church was built in 1893. And so here it is. And of course, you have to have an outhouse, don't you? So the outhouse is still standing as well as the church. And quite a nice view from the back of the outhouse here, looking down. Of course, we could see a little further to the east here. We could see downtown New Haven, but here's the Missouri River. Excuse me. One of the questions, I guess, that I'm still trying to resolve in my own mind was on that contract. It had the two men, and it had written trustees of the A.M.E. church. Now, how could they have been trustees of the A.M.E. church when there wasn't any church yet at that point in time? They did certainly know about the A.M.E. denomination. That had its roots much earlier in time. This is the African Methodist Episcopal Church. That's the denomination, officially organized in 1816. Now, if you try to figure out why that denomination was organized, it's basically pretty simple. The Methodists, who were longstanding, they would allow to come and worship in their building, but they couldn't come to the front door. They'd have to go through the side door, and they'd have to sit up in that balcony. They certainly could not sit with the white folks. And so that kind of discrimination and the nature of the preaching, I'm sure, caused many of these African Americans to say, hey, we don't like this. And so they organized their own church. And that's what this A.M.E., that's the origin of the A.M.E. church then. Now in Missouri, there were no A.M.E. churches prior to 1856. About 1890, and that's about the time here, Annabelle is when we built, just about 3 years after that. There were 128 A.M.E. churches within Missouri with 12,500 members. So the church grew substantially during the post-Civil War period here. Now, you remember in the contract it said it had to be in a good style. Well, they meant it. And so let's take a look at some of the architectural features of the Annabelle Chapel. Just standing in front of the building, of course, you obviously notice the condition of the building, but if you look above the door here, you'll notice above the double door are the rounded arch fan-like windows above. Well, that's kind of a neat frill. It's not something that if you were just building a plain old box building, you wouldn't put windows in like this. This was something a little style. There's 13 individual pieces of glass in that window. The beauty of that is that it does provide, not architecturally it's pleasing to look at, but it allows a light into the building. And you got to remember here in 1890s now, we don't have any electricity yet. We're using, if we're having a function at night, which probably they didn't have very many of anyhow, but they'd have coal oil lamps probably. And then we have these beautiful windows, 6 tall round arch windows, double hung. In other words, just common double hung windows, but they each have nine lights and the fan shaped window above again. Now that design is not a simple design as far as the millwork is concerned. To build that, to make those archways like that, and then on top of it, to make shutters that will cover those windows was also a particular design issue that was not something that the ordinary carpenter could do. The beauty of this is that all of these shingles are inside the building right now. I don't know the details of when they were taken down. I think part of it is because there was some of the shutters were broken. And so I imagine they decided that we'll just take them all down. So the shutters are all there. It is our intent to rehab those shutters and put those shutters back on this building. And I think that's going to be a really fine addition to the building. The thing about, and this is striking, I think. This building has been vacant for over 30 years. And I'm sure the shutters have been off, maybe they've been off for the entire 30 years. Now, what's the likelihood of not having a broken window in this building over 30 years? Now, there are a couple of little cracks, but those are undoubtedly there beforehand. And if you look at this glass, and we tried to illustrate this pictorially, I don't know that it's been really effective, but this is the old rippled glass with the waviness in it. And they tell me that today's glass is extruded glass. It's poured and it's extruded through a machine, and so it gets either crystal clear glass today. But back at this point in time, glass was poured and it had a tendency of not being perfectly uh, clear, I guess you'd say, but it did have these little ripples in it. And that's an indication of old glass. And that's what's in this building. All of the windows are of that style. Interesting. There's a bell outside. I think the bell might have been on a little pedestal or a little tower. We don't know exactly. There is no belfry. There's no bell tower in the church, so it probably was on a pedestal. And so let's go inside. Let's take a look at the inside of the church. I don't know if these are probably not the original steps there because they look like they're concrete blocks. So I'm not sure what the original steps were. So we go in, and the first thing that strikes you is that it's very colorful. And you see the carpeting here along the, I guess this is the communion rail probably. It's red carpeting, and you've got the blue paint, and it's kind of striking in that regard. Now, lighting wise, nothing fancy. Here's call it, I guess, I don't know if you call it a chandelier or what you'd call it. It's just a single bulb there. And I imagine electricity, I'm sure the building was wired maybe sometime in the 1920s. We don't have any record of that. The only other lighting are these light bulbs that were placed above the pulpit or chancel area. And that's kind of a unique thing too. And again, our intent is to restore it exactly the way it is now, and not to disturb any of the original features of the building, whether it be interior or exterior. This would be the pulpit, kind of a center item here. Here's a look at it from down the aisle. The thing I should say to you is that there hasn't been any services. There haven't been any services here for over 30 years. And it's kind of like when the last service was conducted, they walked out, locked the door, and everything is still there as it was when they had the last service. I'll show you some more about that in a second. But behind the pulpit, there are three very padded chairs, big chairs. And this would have been for the pastor and for the deacons or the elders. And then on the wall behind it, this is a 4x8 sheet of, it looks like it could be plywood or masonite. And it's got the Good Shepherd painted on it. Now, the story is that this was done by D. Dan. Now, D. Dan, some of you remember that name. D was a folk artist, a rather accomplished folk artist here in New Haven. And there is some dispute, however, whether this is actually D. Dan's work. We're still kind of doing some more research, trying to find out definitely if it was. The reason for some of the doubt is that the caricatures seem to be too natural. The likenesses are too natural because her tendency was to do more folksy art. Here's some of her. This is about a 3x2 painting that that Dee did of the interior of the church. She called it Cleaning Day, and this is definitely her work because she's got her signature down here at the bottom. And you can see the style of her work. That was her traditional way of painting. And it shows the inside of the church pretty much as I've shown it to you already. Keep that stove in mind. I'll tell you about that in a second. And here's another Dedan work. And this is one that, and I've seen quite a bit of her work, but this is one that I had never seen before and surfaced recently. The people that own this pink house here have the original of this painting. And this pink house is down on Main Street. And the interesting thing about this, and this is almost, well, it was kind of hard to believe, but she put the Annabelle Chapel on this painting almost next door to the pink house. And in the event that the chapel is relocated to the riverfront, it's quite possible that it will be next door to the pink house. So the coincidence of that is just, it's kind of spooky. I don't know if, and I know that Dedan did not think about that when she was painting this, because her nature, she never put buildings necessarily in their correct location, but she would put key buildings around in her artwork just to show the importance of those buildings, not necessarily that they were geographically positioned correctly. Now, where that painting is, that's on it's kind of a recessed, and I don't know, it's part of the chancel area, I guess, that extends about 4 foot beyond the back of the building, and there's a window on either side. And the thing about that is that this is a shingle roof and this is a tin roof, so that suggests that this was probably added at a later date. Again, we don't have any information about that. I think you can be reasonably sure that was the case. And if you're sitting there in one of those cushy chairs, here's the view that you have. You can look out the window and you can see the river in the background. These chairs or seats were used by the choir, and they probably came out of an early theater here. I don't think it was the Walt Theater, which most of you are familiar with, but there was another theater on the corner of Wall Street and Miller, and it may be that those seats came from there. These were not original to the building. And here's where the congregation was seated. There are, I think we counted about 40 of these in the building. And now this is looking back from the altar. The only thing in here that is not original is this paneling here on this back wall and this door. They were added when they put in a furnace, the furnace behind this portion of the wall, and there was a small bathroom behind this area here. The thing that caught my eye as I was looking at this is what you'd call a 6-panel door here. And the thing that's the most striking about that door is the cross. And it may have been that they noticed that too when they purchased the door to put that up. Now, there is the possibility when the renovation is done that some of this might be taken out. I think it would be, for instance, from a light standpoint, if this wasn't here, that will add additional illumination here in the building too. But that's an issue for another day. I mentioned that stove in that Dedan painting. Well, obviously it was there when she painted it. Well, the stove is not there today, but the flue is still there. And of course, here's the opening for the food pipe to go in. And this is just a generic stove, probably very similar to the one that they would have had here, standing here at this point, at this position. Now, this is what they would have had probably from the very beginning to provide heat to the building. There's an interesting sidelight to this, and David Smith, who some of you know, David tells the story that as a child, he would come to this church occasionally with his grandparents. David was not a member of this church, but his grandparents were. And his grandpa had a chair that was, he pointed to it and said, his grandpa always sat right here. He said, I sat next to him. And Grandpa's job, the stove was sitting here in front of this flue. Grandpa's job occasionally was to reach into the coal bucket and throw some coal into the stove so as to be able to keep the fire going. Now, question might be, well, how come they were burning coal? Well, we were a railroad, our New Haven's a railroad town, and a lot of people in New Haven burned coal. That was the most readily accessible fuel. The wood would have been burned out in the countryside, but coal would have been burned here in the city. And here's the piano. There is also an old organ sitting over on the other corner over here. I don't think I've got a photograph of it. But this piano has some history to it. We checked the make of the piano, and this piano goes back to the early 1900s. And we hope that this could become a restoration project. We haven't pulled up or looked in the back or anything to see what kind of condition it is. Obviously, you can see some of the keys are depressed there. So certainly it's going to need some work, although if you hit the keys, it'll still vibrate and you can still make a sound with it, but it's certainly not functional at this point in time. And here's a neat little piano stool that was used. And I told you that like they'd walked out. Well, this was sitting there just like this. Here's the offering plate. And well, none of my group put anything in the offering, so it's still empty. But, and here's the hymnals, the Methodist hymnal here. And this hymnal over here, I can't quite read. It looks like it's maybe a little bit, no, it's a, no, I don't know. But things were just left out. And here's the communionware. And they used the little individual cups. They may have had a common cup too that they used for communion, but they had a very nice communion set. And it's still there in the building, just where it was left. And there's a box full of these. And I remember these as a kid going to church. We didn't have air conditioning, and of course Annabelle Chapel didn't have air conditioning either. And so this was the best you could do, was to have a fan. And these fans were provided by usually local undertakers. And this is L.C. Furtick's son. They had donated this fan. And so as to be sure that nobody took the fans, they wrote on the back, Annabelle Chapel A.M.E. So you better believe this is our fan. Don't you dare try to take that fan from in here, because we're going to need it. There's two plaques on the outside of the building. Back in 1992, the Preservation Society, along with a couple of other people, decided that this building was unique enough to consider placing it on the National Registry of Historic Places. Now, that's not a simple task. You got to go through and do a lot of research. You got to document your claim, and this was done. Extensive research was done, and of course, some of this research is information that I'm sharing with you this evening. But they were able to qualify, and so this plaque was placed there. And the importance of this is that this is the only building in New Haven that's on the National Registry of Historic Places. So, my goodness, certainly we need to save it. And then there's another plaque on the other side of the door in memory of Hazel Corrine Hinkle, 1915-2006, dedicated and loving member of the Annabelle Chapel. The importance here is that she was the last living member prior to her death in 2006 at the age of 90. Wonderful lady. I knew her a little bit, but I know maybe, I don't know, maybe some of you knew her better than I did. But she was the guiding force during the last 10, 15 years of this church. Oftentimes when they would have a service back in the 1980s and so on, there might be 4 people there, maybe 5. If there was a special event, maybe a little larger group. But the population declined from the point where back in the early 1900s, there would have been 30, 40 people there, to the point where there were only a few living members, and Hazel was the last of those members. Now, what about the building? What kind of problems does it have? Let's just run through that quickly here. There's a lot of work that needs to be done on the building. When the Preservation Society started to think about doing the renovation, we actually hired an engineer and had an engineering study done to see exactly what kinds of issues the building had. There's some that are very visible issues. Much of the siding, of course, painting is going to be paramount. The whole thing needs to be painted. Some of the siding, excuse me, is going to have to be replaced. One of the issues is that this wall here is sitting on the ground. There was a stone foundation under here, but that stone has basically deteriorated, and it was so brittle that it's broken up, so that the wood frame of this building, the floor joists and the outer beam of the building, is sitting on the ground. Guess what? The termites love it. And so this portion, plus about halfway in on the floor joist, is termite paradise. It's been eaten up. So that's going to be a sizable issue. The building is going to have to be jacked up so that that understructure can be replaced. You can see some other issues here with the siding. Roof needs to be painted. That's not such a big deal. If we go to the inside, this is where the bathroom had been. And for some reason, the bathroom was torn out and there's no floor in it. Plaster damage on the ceiling. So we asked the question, what should be done with Annabelle Chapel? Well, obviously, if it's going to be preserved, there's going to have to be some renovation done. The cost, as estimated by our engineering study, was actually in excess of $100,000. Now, we've looked at that, and we've looked at it with the hope that there would be some savings there, but at least 75,000. I'm not sure we can get it done for 75,000, because there's a lot of work that's going to have to be done. The next issue, and this one is a bit more, I guess, controversial in a way, although we haven't had a great many objections, I guess. There have been some, and I would not deny that, is the whole issue of relocation of the church. Now, why would you want to relocate the church? It's up there in this beautiful site on the hill, so forth. But there's two major issues. One, there's virtually no parking. If you were going to have an event up there, you would have to bus people up, have some kind of trolley service or something. You can park maybe 3 or 4 cars, and that's actually stretching it a bit. You have to understand that when the people were going here, when our African American friends were going to church there, they lived 3 blocks away, and they walked. They walked up that hill. They never. Oh, I'm not going to say that some of them couldn't have driven there, but generally they just walked. So they weren't concerned about parking. The second issue is that it's, even though it's in a beautiful location, it's in sort of I don't want to say remote, because if I lived up there, I wouldn't want to say that I was living remote, but it's a very low traffic area. And that I'm sure that there are many people in New Haven that don't even know that church is up because they've never driven up that street. And if we were to try to make the improvements on it and try to highlight the contribution of African Americans by putting up some photo exhibits or whatever in that building, how many tourists are going to go up there? So the suggestion was, initially we talked about putting it on the city park. And so that idea was thrown around. But then someone said, well, how many tourists that go to see historic downtown go to the city park? And we had to confess that probably very few would, and so it probably wouldn't get a lot of attention there. So the next idea was, well, is there some place downtown more in the historic district where this could be placed? And so we had conversations with the city about that. And I think that the general feeling was that if there was a way that we could put it in that historic district, there it could have high visibility. It could be open for visits. It could be used as a venue for special events. There could be weddings there. There could be church services. There could be public meetings. During the tourist season, possibly could be open where people could walk in and see whatever displays or exhibits we had in it, and thus be able to provide a good history of the African American contribution to the development of our community. So that is kind of where we're at now. Now, none of this is etched in stone by any means, but this is a rendering of what it might look like. Although I would say it wouldn't be oriented in this fashion; it'd probably be turned around the other way if it goes to that particular location. We looked at some other locations like where the caboose is. There was discussion about putting it on the other end of Main Street toward the Granard building. The space just simply was not there. And in the case of the caboose would have to be moved to a different location, and so we get into those issues as well. So the city, and I have to say that the Preservation Society has been extremely pleased with the support that we have gotten from the city of New Haven. This was a resolution that they passed back last month, the 12th of April. And I just shared it with you because there's some interesting things in here. And we're talking about the Board of Aldermen here now and the mayor. And the resolution, whereas the New Haven Preservation Society proposed to move the chapel to a designated riverfront location, and whereby the city of New Haven authorizes and approves the site. This is the site we're talking about. And so the aldermen strongly desire to support and promote the relocation and renovation of it. Now, therefore, we resolve the Board of Aldermen for the City of New Haven as follows. And these are some of the things that they have, we haven't really pushed them on this. This is what they've agreed to do. And I think it's fantastic. I know our members feel it's fantastic. They've offered to do some site work and provide utilities. Unfortunately, there's a tree that has to be moved, and that's going to be removed whether this goes there or not, because the Corps of Engineers has said it has to be removed. And install the sidewalk, landscape the site, so forth and so on. So that is a very positive thing as far as the ultimate relocation of this. So I'm going to bring this to a close. I thank you for your attention. I just want to summarize it with the Preservation Society is dedicated to the restoration of this thing and project. We don't know when this is going to start. It may be this year. It may be next year first, because it's tied somewhat to the Main Street project that the City of New Haven has been approved for, where there will be some major improvements on that street. If you are so inclined, we ask you to be a friend of Annabelle. If you can provide a donation, be a volunteer maybe once we get into the work part of it, or if nothing more, simply spread the story of Annabelle. And here's donations can be sent to the Preservation Society. Here's our address. We also have a GoFundMe account, and I think it's partly chopped off there, but it's Help Preserve the Past. That's what it says. Help GoFundMe, Help Preserve the Past. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and so donations may be tax exempt for you. That's something you have to deal with your tax accountant about. But we will provide receipts for donations if you're interested in having a receipt. This is my email here and my phone number. I welcome your calls, your comments. I'm going to come back to this frame in just a minute. I got one last frame, and I just want to say thanks to a lot of the photographs were taken by Tony Carosella, some of them by Stephen Bybee. And again, I want to thank Lee for her help in making this possible. She had to train an old guy, and thank goodness she was able to get it in my head how to do this. And I think it's technology. And again, I thank all of you who are watching this evening. So with that, I'll leave this frame up, and I'll bid everybody a good evening. And thank you very much again.
David, we did have one question in the chat, and I wanted to open it up to questions if anyone else had any. But Norman asked, is the roof the original roof, and does it need to be replaced?
No. Well, first of all, I think it is the original roof, and no, it does not need to be replaced. That's one of the simple projects, is to paint the roof. I mean, you know, I'm not going to climb up there and paint it, obviously, but I think the roof can be kept as it is, yes.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions for David? Diane asked, what is the current location? Do you want the address, Diane, to perhaps drive by and visit?
Okay. It's on Selma Street, and I'll have to apologize. I don't know but here, you can't go wrong. You go down Olive, and you're on Olive Street, you'll find us going into downtown New Haven. Selma Street is the last left-hand street prior to getting into downtown New Haven off of Olive. Selma goes to the top of the hill and it ends, and the church is at the top of the hill. So you can easily find it. when you turn on and drive up Selma Street.
And
I'm
I just,
sorry,
oh, sorry.
we can find the street number, but again, I haven't committed that to memory.
I found it and it is in the chat, so folks can put it into their GPS.
Okay, good.
Will renovations happen first or will the move happen first?
Okay, that's an interesting question. I have a feeling that it's going to happen this way. We've contacted a mover who has assured us that this building can be moved, number one. In order to do the moving, they have to jack it up off the ground. Okay, what we've asked is, could you do that? Could you jack it up off the ground and then give us a few weeks to work on the understructure? And so at least that portion of the building would have to be renovated probably before we move it. Otherwise, it's probably not secure enough in order to make the move. So then once that's done, then it could be moved. And then the rest of the rehabilitation of the building could be done at the new site. It wouldn't necessarily all have to be done here at the original site. And at that point, we're going to be looking for volunteers who can handle a paintbrush and can maybe help with some cleaning and various things that are going to have to be done. Now, some of it will be done by craftsmen. For instance, putting the plaster up, I'm sure we're going to have to find somebody who's skilled with plastering. But there are a lot of other things that could be done by volunteers.
And Norman just pointed out in the chat, wondering about plaster crumbling during the move.
Yes, that would be one reason that you wouldn't want to do it prior to the move, because there are some things that you're going to have to do. Very likely, we're going to have to take all the windows out of their frames, because we don't want to damage any of that original glass. So we probably take the windows out, cover the openings with plastic, and then make the move, and then rehab the windows and put the windows back in. So we've been thinking about the sequence of events that we'll have to follow once we get to that point.
If anyone is in the room, has the chat open, the first link in the chat is to the GoFundMe site. And then I also just provided a link to a post-event survey, if you have a couple of minutes and you wouldn't mind filling that out. But about fundraising efforts, David, do you want to speak to that a little bit more in terms of where you are and where you're going?
We feel like that has been progressing very nicely. We do need to raise additional money. At this point, we have pledges for around $70,000. So I think that's outstanding. We do plan to write, we've written a few grants. Unfortunately, none of them have been successful, but we're looking at some more grants, and with the intent of applying and with the hope that we'll be successful with some of the grants as well.
Thank you. And David, Norman, and Louise are saying thank you in the chats. And Stephen Bybee, if that's your last name, saying thank you and that he hopes to come down again to take more photos when your free time allows, and to help when the time comes.
Great, thank you.
Any other thoughts or additions? Thank you so much for all being here. This presentation will go up on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now,